Brought to you by Charity Mobile. Switch to the phone company that supports your beliefs. All plans start under $50 before taxes and surcharges. Use promo code TRADITION at CharityMobile.com for a special offer.
When talking about the crisis in the church, the first issue that comes to mind for American Catholics is that of Ted McCarrick and priests like him, those who had a taste for young, specifically teenagers, and specifically young men. Bishops who hide the escapades of their priests by moving them around when they've become on the verge of getting caught or even after they've been caught. That kept happening even after McCarrick-type priest problem went viral in the early and mid-2000s, and they've clearly learned nothing. The bishops in all too many dioceses in the U.S. have flirted with making the James Martin sin normal by giving in to secular demands for morality. Those two, the James Martin sin, that sin that Father James Martin, F.J., has too big of an interest in for a priest to be anything but weird, is directly correlated to the evil deeds of Ted McCarrick. They cannot be separated. The world accuses the church of being wrong on morality since the beginning, of taking Jesus' words and twisting them, of misinterpreting Scripture, or of saying Scripture is full of errors. And all too many bishops and too many priests agree with them. They are willing to concede the point the secular world makes because all too many of them are faithless, or they are so attached to their sins that their salvation is in grave jeopardy. They respond to crises in the church of these kinds by adopting secular solutions. Some of them over the top. Some of them so absurd you can't take them seriously, except you should, because when you see these things, it becomes obvious that the consequences for what they do are absurd. Headline from Complicit Clergy. Archdiocese of New Orleans proposes evil deeds of the flesh. Again, it's YouTube, have to be careful. Point system as part of its bankruptcy settlement. You may not be aware, but the Archdiocese of New Orleans has come to a settlement with many of the known victims of evil priests from the past. And they're trying to put this issue away, but the way they're going to handle this is going to guarantee that this is going to be a problem again in the future. We may be in a low point for this problem, but it will come back until actual reforms, in this case restorations of Catholic morality, are done from the AMBO every Sunday at Mass and enforced by bishops and by the Holy Father that men morally unfit to be priests do not find their way into the seminary. And whenever somebody has been found to have snuck their way in, they're with extreme prejudice removed from the seminary. So they do not become priests. But unfortunately, the opposite is the case. It's a lot of times morally reprobate young men who are brought in. And it is the conservative, traditionally minded young men, those who are attached to the rosary and the old mass and attached to saying an older form of the breviary every day, who have a devotion to Our Lady that isn't just words but actual deeds of prayer. They find those men, and in all too many cases, kick them out of seminary for being too rigid and too clericalist. I'm going to show you here this Complicit Clergy story, because it just shows you how out of touch with reality all of this is. From the article, quote, documents filed recently in the New Orleans Roman Catholic Archdiocese's 5-year bankruptcy case provide more clarity on how claims will be doled out to those harmed by evil priests if a proposed settlement is approved. Points will be assigned to each claim made on the severity of the evil deed done and its effect on each victim's life. But the records do not offer much clarity on how much actual money those points will be worth. Yes, ladies and gentlemen, a point-based system. Claims that a Catholic Church employee used force to commit evil deeds of the flesh will be worth twice as much money to those who survive it as having a priest engage in what would normally be the private sin, as Pius XII called it, in front of them. 4 times more than if a cleric touched someone inappropriately, and 7 times more than being shown evil films that you typically find online for free these days, according to details from a settlement disclosure statement filed and amended recently. Coming up in October, hundreds of those harmed by when they were young by clergy will get to vote to approve or reject a settlement with the U.S.'s second oldest archdiocese worth between $180 million and $235 million. There's a reason I don't typically report on a lot of these kinds of stories, actually, this specifically when a priest is accused of something, and that's because, quite frankly, aside from it being impossible for a priest to get his good name back, as I've shown you in reports out of Chicago, that there are people who will just fraudulently claim this happened to them because the Catholic Church is an easy target and has been since about 2005. And so even some of the bad bishops have recognized this and taken some basic prudential measures to prevent at least people from taking advantage of the legal system to go after the church for a quick, lucrative payday. What we saw here is an absurd solution to this problem. It might be acceptable if dioceses had tightened up the rules on who can enter seminary and become a priest by barring James Martin types from the priesthood. But instead, they've done nothing of real note to prevent this from happening, at least in some dioceses. So these problems will continue to plague the church and bankrupt her of both her material treasures and, more importantly, make countless people not trust the church Christ established, acting as a serious bar to conversion. And I will tell you, just from reading my own comment section, I cannot go a day without somebody commenting that they had been on the verge of conversion, but these kinds of stories keep people from wanting to come into the church. And it's not the reporting on these stories that's the problem. It's the fact that this is a reality still. You don't condemn the messenger for bringing light to slime, for shedding light on an evil situation so that something can be done about it. This problem persists and it keeps people from coming into the faith. And you can put that on top of, the lack of belief in the real presence by most Catholics who go to Mass on a regular basis, and the lack of adherence to or the outright rejection of Catholic morality by those who go to Mass on a regular basis. We should take these things deadly seriously, but we don't, because at the end of the day, a lot of the bishops and a lot of the priests are faithless, or they are so wrapped up in sins of the flesh that they have decided that the church must be wrong on those things, because boy, do those sins make them feel great. Aren't they so wonderful? They must clearly be a gift from God. That's their thinking, at the very least, if they believe. And remember, this is just one aspect of the heresy of modernism. And the modernists today truly believe, their most influential ones, truly believe that they are on a God-ordained mission to change the church, to rescue her from the darkness of rigidity and clericalism, that they believe the church went off the rails at some point and that Jesus is so very lucky to have them here to fix the mistakes. They believe this stuff. I'm not exaggerating. They say stuff like that. And this is one aspect of it. You'll see their arguments about that sin that James Martin loves so much, where they'll say that the scripture got it wrong, or that the account of those cities destroyed by God in the Old Testament for these sins aren't actually about that. They're about lack of hospitality to visitors and things, and how we need to treat migrants better. That's what they turn those stories into, because they believe the church, the magisterium of the church, has been interpreting scripture and teaching scripture wrong for 1,500 years or more. They believe it. That's how you know they're heretics. Now, another example of this comes from the Diocese of Charlotte, who had this not terribly surprising story to turn heads with. This one is just unbelievable in its audacity. So go to Gloria TV for the headline: Charlotte Bishop sides with pro-James Martin school against concerned parents. The Diocese of Charlotte, led by Bishop Michael Martin, notorious for banning the Roman Rite Mass, has sided with a private Catholic school that expelled 2 children after their parents objected to its embrace of the James Martin ideology. The Turpins lawsuit, which is currently being heard by North Carolina Supreme Court, asks whether a private school can promise open dialogue and then expel students in retaliation for their parents' protected speech. The family argued that the Charlotte Latin School, which was previously marketed as apolitical, adopted a pro-James Martin curriculum under the new leadership in 2020. This introduced graphic material and politically biased teaching. After leading a group of concerned parents and presenting objections to the board, amid assurances that there would be no retaliation, the Turpin's children were abruptly expelled. Earlier this week, the Catholic Diocese of Charlotte supported the school's contractual right to remove students whose parents undermine its mission. The diocese argued that such provisions protect the autonomy of private religious schools. End quote. The parents were a threat to the mission of that school. The mission of that school is to teach Latin and uphold the Catholic faith. It is a Catholic school on paper. That's their mission. And what were the parents wanting? A Catholic education for their children. Unbelievable. Or would be if you don't follow these kinds of stories on a regular basis. The problem is so pervasive, though, that Catholic universities are nearly all guilty of similar offenses. So we go to another story. These all broke in the last few days. It's amazing, like in the last 36 hours or so. Headline from Complicit Clergy. Catholic University of San Diego wants community to avoid using men and women language. Do I need to go over that one? They're using inclusive secular language. There are more than two options now. The world is even rejecting that stuff. At least the general public is. So yeah, the powers of the world are really upset that they've lost the public, but they're clearly going to continue pushing on this subject. And it's worth reminding ourselves that public opinion, of course, doesn't really matter. If the public was with them on this, it still wouldn't make it right. But the church has said, scripture says, tradition says, the magisterium says, consistently, what is said in Genesis, that there were two options. And that is the reality of things. The science backs it up. It doesn't back up the secular position. They invent new social sciences to try to come up with it, and social sciences are bunk. And I say that as a trained social scientist with a PhD in social science. Okay, social sciences have become utter trash. A Catholic university. In fact, actually, Catholic universities are where you'll often find the worst of this stuff. That's why most Catholic universities are failing. Maybe they hitch their wagon to the religion of sport to save themselves if they've got a good sports program. But beyond that, they're failing. But I'm curious what you think about this, so let me know in the comments, please. And like and subscribe if you haven't. It does help. Sharing this on social media helps a lot, too. If you've ever thought about supporting the work we do here at Return to Tradition through Patreon, Subscribestar, the Subscribe Plus button, which is the old YouTube Join button, or any of the other options that are in the description box below, all of which were asked for by the viewers of this channel, it would be greatly appreciated, and they do help keep these daily messages coming. And let me know your thoughts on all this in the comments, please, and as always, pray for the church. I'm Anthony Stine. Ave Maria.